So my name's Pete Turner, I'm 33 years old and I'm a mentalist from a city in West Yorkshire called Bradford. And I didn't start out as a mentalist, I was a magician for a long time. In fact, my introduction into the mystery art started when I was about 4 years old. And it started quite by accident, to be honest. So my mum at the time were a bit of a party animal. And I remember on Christmas Eve, it's a very vague memory, but there's been pieces that have been added and told to me by other people. My mum wanted to go out. She wanted to go out drinking on Christmas Eve, so she'd taken me and my brother Sam to my nan's house and banged on the door. And I remember this exchange between my mum and my nan, and they're shouting at each other, and my nan's like, if you decide that you're going out, you don't come back. And she slammed the door. My mum, my brother and I started walking back down the street, and it were almost like my mum turned round, did a full 180, brought us back to my nan's house, put us on the doorstep, banged on the door and walked off before my nan came out. Of course, my nan opens the door, sees me and my brother on the doorstep, and that was it. I grew up with my nan from that point. And we got taken inside. I woke up the next day, and of course my nan wasn't expecting to have us on Christmas Day, so she was doing whatever she could to make us feel at home. And I remember that she put us in front of the television, our channel surfing, looking for kids programs, and all of a sudden I saw this really well-dressed gentleman called Lance Burton come out on stage and start performing incredible miracles with doves and candles and canes. And growing up in this really rough background, you know, we called it the ghetto. Growing up in this rough background, seeing this man in this beautiful three-piece suit, looking really slick, producing doves and candles. I remember sitting there and thinking that this guy looked like the king of the world. And I was so taken back by it because it were beyond the scope of anything that I could ever imagine. Even at 4 years old, you know, with the imagination of a child, seeing this stuff, it just didn't seem like it were earthly possible. Now, of course, I didn't have access to books and magic tricks. I didn't have access to knowing about how to get magic. So I found an old pack of cards in the bottom drawer, and it were a dog-eared battered deck. And I remember just annoying the hell out of my nan and my uncle, which were my nan's son. And I remember just going in, let me show you this, let me show you this, let me show you this. And I'd create tricks and effects. I got to about 6 or 7. At the time, I were infrequently seeing my dad. And so we'd go to my dad's house every other weekend or whenever my dad wasn't working. And my dad had a bit of an interesting job. He was a falconer, you know, he flew birds of prey. And because of that, that meant that he travelled around the country and he put on gala shows, and obviously we had an upbringing around birds of prey.
When Peter was growing up, we you know, family, myself, his mum, we were separated. And Peter's nana, we didn't have much money, we were working class. And if he wanted tricks or illusions or books, we would try our best to get them, but quite often you couldn't just go to the local supermarket or corner shop. You had to mail order these things, and in fairness, even back then, the internet wasn't really like it is now. It was there, but it wasn't quite as big. You couldn't just go onto eBay and buy something in 10 seconds flat. And his uncle Neil, he was a magician, but not a magician. He was trying to be a magician. He was trying his best, and bought quite a few different books. And he said you can borrow the Royal Road to Card Magic, but I have to be honest, he was a little bit tight. So he said you can have it for overnight, knowing full well that he'd been reading this book for probably about 2 months and was still struggling with the first 4 pages.
He's kept absolutely bugging me. Well, what are you learning? What are you learning? What are you learning? And this were his tenacity. He was hungry for it. But the thing with Peter is, you lend him something, you'll never get it back. Well, what I did was, I gave him the book, and I said, you can have the book when I go to bed. And then when I get up, I want the book back, just so I know I get it back, basically. But I said, but on the proviso, he can show me 5 tricks in the morning.
So anyway, Peter took the book, pretty much read it. Not only read it, but read it and understood it. And then came back like the next day with a pack of, they weren't even bicycle cards because we were that skinny. He had this pack of cheap cards from the bottom drawer in the kitchen, and he's showing his Uncle Neil and all these card tricks and forces and everything else that's and all sorts of other weird things. And
he'd read the whole book in one night. He said, I've learnt a lot of tricks. So I tested him. So there's your cards, off you pop.
Pete, in about 3 seconds, flat overtook him.
My stipulation was 5 card tricks. he showed me 7 and he wanted to show me more, but I wanted my breakfast, so I was like, thank you very much, Peter, and off I popped. So in that respect, he has got a hunger for learning.
It's fair to say that I think at this point that we kind of knew, and Uncle Neil was a bit like, whoa, this is a bit special.
It were really down to dedication.
I think he's quite obsessive, so he needed something to kind of like focus on and build and concentrate on and evolve and almost get to the point where he was the best of the best.
It was really the first time that I felt at home with anything, and it sort of the first love that I ever had, I suppose. And I got to 12 years old, I went to work as a pitchman on a stall at the Peace Hall. And that's where I really started to thrive as a creator. And I remember being at this stall and seeing a book by Andrew Mayne. I noticed the small print, and the small print tells you the copyright information and where the books are copyrighted to, and it had an address in America. But I never thought about the fact that anything from America could be in England. So my scope of the world was so small that it was just Queensbury and Halifax. And I read this copyright and I closed my eyes for a second, and I got this really weird butterfly feeling in my stomach at the thought that maybe one day that somebody on the other side of the world might know who I am, right? And it were really, really inspiring. It were a really warm feeling. And for the first time in my life, I sort of realised that there might be something more out there for me. Having that idea of being on a platform that's big enough to be seen by the entire world was such a mind-blowing concept. And then David Blaine came out in between that time, and David Blaine were an absolute master of the craft. Now, he were a man of few words, but those few words were so powerful and impactful that I wanted to be him. You know, street magic became a thing. Him and Paul Zenon really revolutionised the way that magic was seen and it was performed. And all of a sudden I wanted to be a street magician. I'd watch what David Blaine would do, and then I'd figure out my own way to do it. And I started imitating what he was doing to impress others. And then I hit a brick wall. And there were troubles at home, with them struggling with money, and then my uncle, who he were a bit of an odd character. He'd go to work, and I think I tried to sort of work out why he was the way he was, but he'd have a bad day at work and he'd come home and then he'd take it out on us. He'd take it out on me and my brother, and he'd go to town on us. He'd kick 10 bells of shit out of us, and we'd have to pretend to be asleep before he come back, because if we didn't and he saw us, then we'd get a hiding. And he'd come home from work fuming, and he decided that he was going to take it out on me. And I remember that there were 2 flights of stairs and we were up on the top. He'd taken the light bulbs out of the room, he'd taken the switch off the wall so I couldn't put another light bulb in, he'd taken my shoes so I couldn't leave the house, and he was just being an out and out. And I remember thinking to myself, I've got a right to say something back here because I'm not in the wrong. And so I opened my mouth, and I made a big mistake because he chased me down the stairs, down the second flight of stairs, and there were a door that separated the little hallway at the bottom of the stairs from the living room. And I grabbed hold of the door and I was screaming, "Nan, please, Nan, Nan," and I slammed the door. I pulled it that hard that my fingers were on one side of the door and I were on the other side. And they were just held on by this little bit of skin here just across, like this. And there were just blood all up the door. I was screaming, and my nan's saying, "What's happening, what's happening?" She didn't know what were happening. And so I'm holding my hand like this, and I go into my nan and I'm holding these fingers. And I remember calling my dad.
Basically chopped a couple of finger ends off, I think, from memory, and ended up being rushed at BRI. And I can't really recall what was happening, but we pretty much thought that would be the end of his card tricks.
And I remember the nurse on the desk at the hospital taking one look at it and going, "We're getting you through to the emergency ward now." And she took me straight through to the emergency ward. We had a surgeon down within the space of about 10 minutes, which is unheard of at the Bradford Royal Infirmary. And they took one look at my fingers, and they gave me something for pain relief, and it failed. And they said, "Look, you have a choice. We can either wait and then give him the pain relief again, but he's losing a lot of blood and he might end up losing the tips of his fingers." And they just had to go for it. And they performed surgery on my fingers.
There were quite a lot of delicate stitch work went on. It wasn't just like stitches from the outside, it was microsurgery, so it was inside and outside. And we sort of thought that that would be the end of it. And I think for quite a while afterwards, because of the no feeling in the fingertips, it did sort of take a long time to recover. And
I didn't care about the fingers. I really didn't care about the fingers. What I cared about is the one thing that I'd loved and had been part of my life for such a long time. You know, within 24 hours, I'd lost who I was, and that were it. And so I'd gone home, and in the background of all this, I were a guitarist for a band called Slim Reaper. So I sat down with my guitar and I just tried to fingerpick, and it hurt so much. It felt like razor blades cutting my fingers off over and over again. But I fought through it because I thought I can't lose everything. And slowly but surely, my fingers started to move again. Now I don't have the same mobility in this hand that I have in this one. I can move it, I can grab stuff, but the fingers, they're constantly like this. And even when I try to straighten them, you can see the little fingers going, and this one's all curled. It just doesn't operate the way it's supposed to operate. But I got them moving. And then I went to physiotherapy, and I remember the nurse saying to me at physiotherapy, don't expect too much. You know, they've got to do a psychological evaluation before you begin, but she's like, you know, don't expect too much. Don't expect to just start moving your fingers. Don't expect to just start doing stuff again. And we got in there, and then I started moving them. And she was blown away at the fact that my fingers were moving, because she'd obviously seen multiple patients that had been through similar accidents, and they lost all the feeling in their fingers. And she asked me how I'd got to the point I had, and I told her. And she sort of took me to the side with my nan, and she said, you know, if he'd not been doing what we were doing, we didn't recommend it. We couldn't recommend it because we wasn't allowed to. But if he'd have not continued to do what he did, he'd have probably never moved his fingers ever again. And so I accidentally ended up saving myself. But when I went back to the cards, I was never as sharp as I was before.
I don't think he was ever as good as before, but he got back to somewhere near, but he didn't have that, for me personally, that same edge that he had before.
And one of the things that really got me over that were watching Derren Brown on the television. And I remember that this guy, again, really slickly dressed, really elegant, comes out and starts doing these incredible things that I couldn't figure out. And for the first time in my life, I couldn't backtrack how he was doing what he was doing. Now, this is a mind-blowing concept to me, because going from watching effects right from a young age, see my uncle do stuff and his friends, and then performers on television, and then the market stall, and then more performers on television, and being able to figure out all the way along a version of it in an instant, watching this guy and not having anywhere to go, it really now gets you to the point where you're like, I need to figure this out. You know, I was sat there thinking I need to solve this problem. And so I started designing mentalism routines, and I decided, I'm not having to use my hand here. But the one thing that I didn't realise is that there were a lot more than met the eye. Now, I'm not going to go into the techniques and methods that Derren Brown uses, but his team were the best of the best. And in my opinion, Derren is the best of the best. And when you were watching him, you didn't know what was happening. So I was designing routines to replicate what I was seeing. What I didn't realise that I was doing is designing routines that were perceived to be impossible by the mentalism community as a whole, because I had no idea of what the limitations were in mentalism, because I'd never talked or seen another mentalist. So I'd seen Derren Brown, seen him doing this stuff on TV. The whole presentation wasn't there, so I were replicating what I was seeing, achieving what I was seeing, going out and performing what I was seeing, and I had no concept that this were considered impossible until maybe 10 years later down the line, right? So I had good 10 years, a decade of creating impossible things, so that when it came to actually moving into mentalism, which I will get into in a second, it already gave me that head start that I needed, right? So from there, I started working tables and working men's clubs. I worked in an Indian kitchen. I worked as a picker and a packer at a packaging company. I worked as a painter. I worked as a tiler, and I worked for Bullock Construction, which were a construction firm doing the joinery. I did some time working as an electrician's apprentice. And so I had a lot of jobs, a lot of different jobs. And then I went to work at White Rose Cutting Forms. And this were the last real job that I'd have, a last trade job that I'd have. And I was working at White Rose Cutting Forms. And as I say, in the background of all this, I was also playing in a band. And one of my inspirations in music were a band called the Bad Beat Review. guys called Patrick Sherry and Brendan Sherry, for me, were the pinnacle of where I wanted to be in music. And I remember having this little old Squire, and I'd taken it and I'd had them sign it. And exactly a week after I'd had them sign this little sunburst Squire with a Union Jack on the headstock, they went to support a band called Hardfi, I think, or Lo-Fi, but they went to support this band, and they were on the Enemy stage, so they were just about to break it. They were at the point where they're just about to go astronomical. And Pat Sherry jumped up to this stage light, and they'd put vandal grease on the top of it, and he slipped off of it and came down, and he cracked his skull open, and he died a few hours later. And I remember finding out about this from Christy, who were obviously devastated, and we were devastated because good friends of the family, you know, one of your inspirations that you know has just been taken away. And I remember going into work and saying, I need a day off work. I need a day off work because the funeral's coming up. And they said to me that if you go, you're still in your trial period at this job. If you go to that funeral, that goes down as you've missed a day at work. And if you've missed a day at work, one of the things is that you fail to pass your trial period. So it was a choice between going to this funeral or staying at work. So I decided I was going to stay at work. So the service started to go on, and it was playing on my mind all day long, just on repeat all day long. And I decided, that's it, f*** it. I put my stuff down. I was walking out. A guy called Howard says, where you going? I said, Howard, you can shove your job up your ass. And I walked out, and the boss were called Phil Turner, which is not my dad, but it were another Phil Turner. And Phil Turner rings me, and he says, where are you going? I said, I'm off to this funeral. I said, if it had been somebody that were in your family or one of your friends, you'd have gone. And all I'm doing is exactly what you'd do in this situation. And I put the phone down, and that was it. I went to the after do, and I got sacked the next day. But I didn't care. I wasn't bothered. At that point, then I had no job for a while, and then my partner at the time, Sarah, she got pregnant with my son Zach. And I remember being so poor that I was living in this little flat. And that's pretty much how our life went. And then my son was born, and obviously still struggling to find a job. We were going through a recession round about that period, so there were no work for anybody, and people who were working, they'd been laid off. And I remember that we didn't have enough money for formula, milk for the baby, so I'd steal from the supermarket to be able to feed my son. And it was just a struggle like that. She couldn't work because she just had the baby. I couldn't find work. I was doing a day here and there for agency, but it was never enough. And it really put a rift between us, and we started bickering and arguing. And one thing we both agreed on is that we weren't going to do that in front of my son. So we parted company. And then when we parted company, you know, I decided that were it. I had to make a change. I couldn't be like that for my son, you know. So little Zachary's 6 months old, and I made the decision at that point that this is it. You know, like I've not got a job anyway. I'm gonna put all my focus into my mentalism. I'm gonna see if I can make a go of this. And I really, really from that point put my head into the game. And then my life changed overnight, and it changed because the internet had started really connecting people. And I remember joining Facebook and seeing all these amazing artists that I'd read about. And I remember reaching out to Kenton, and I saw a contact form on the website, and the contact form were to inquire about the material that were on the website, but I thought I'd take advantage of it. Because in life, if you don't roll the dice, you'll never get a 6. In the words of Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. So I decided to take a shot. So I'm writing this email out, really nervously sat there, writing this scrappy biography about me out and my life and other things. And it ended up being about this long. Talked about some of the things that I'd created, and I nervously hovered my hand over the send button, and then I clicked send, and that were it. And then everything was quiet for a few days. And then I got a response.
One day I got an email from this person who I had not met before. His name was Peter Turner, and he said, hey, I'm learning these things. I really like what you're doing. And I have some of my own thoughts about that. Can I share some of them with you? Well, you know, I get lots of this stuff every day, and usually I say no. But the way he phrased a few things, I thought, okay, I want to check out what he's up to. So he sent me a couple ideas, and I said, all right, look, why don't you do that, but try this and change this wording and play with that.
I made it my mission to try to represent myself the best way I could to Kenton, and that were it. A few weeks later, maybe a month later, I got a message back saying, are you looking to put something out?
We talked about multiple realities, we talked about doing readings as outs, and making mentalism have more meaning, not just be a bunch of tricks. We talked about mental card forcing, which was really out there at the time, and having outs on purpose, where you would try to miss things so that you had outs, you could take giant risks. These are big concepts of mine, and Peter heard that and said, okay, I'm gonna do that. And he would go out and do it, and then he would come back and say, hey, I look at this. Here's a couple new tricks I came up with based on some of these ideas, and here's a couple totally different ideas. And he would write me these things, and after a while I said, okay, are you looking to put something out? And he said, well, yeah, sure, that'd be good. I said, okay.
And I knew at that point that I were about to release my first book. And he said to me, this is not going to be easy.
I can lend my name to yours because I like how you're thinking, but I'm going to warn you, this is going to be hardcore. And so he would send me like material for a book, and I would write him back and go, this part is horrible. It's absolutely horrible. Get rid of it. He'd be like, oh, okay. Which is, not what most people do. Most people go, what do you mean it's horrible? It's not horrible, it's brilliant. But he understood. It was like, okay, why is it horrible?
I love constructive criticism. I don't mind when somebody says this could change, that could change, this could be done better, because having that perspective from somebody that's been there and has been there a long time, you realize that you've got to take that advice. You can't feel butthurt. So I took the advice on board, I went away and then I put my spin on it, and I added little subtleties and touches, and then I took it back.
He would take those things and refine them. He didn't mind hearing it wasn't perfect right out of the gate. And that's what it takes. He was flexible and he was willing to keep learning. He's still willing to keep learning. And that's really what it's all about. Pretty soon he was sending me things that I went, oh my God, this is brilliant. And he showed me a video of something once and I went, I honestly have no idea what it is. I don't even know what you did. I'm stumped.
And that went backwards and forwards, and maybe a year or two before the book were ready, Kenton put his name to it, added his touches, his refinements, and then the book went out. And the rest from that point is, as I say, history. Overnight, everything changed. To be able to move forward in the story, we have to go back.
My first experiences with Pete were, I guess, about 10 years ago or so, when I saw an online lecture he did. I believe it was his first online lecture. And I was totally blown away by it, just because it was different. It just felt so fresh. And
what used to be impossible is now becoming normal. Propless mentalism is the term now.
the methods are so clever. And that's the thing. I think what really blew me away was that the storytelling and the ideas behind it all were, you almost didn't need the effect. You didn't need a trick. You didn't need a magic effect to go on, because everything else that was going on was so engaging already. And then the fact that there is all this other thing going on and these impossible mind reading feats and all those other things were just like the icing on the cake.
Of the whole term propless mentalism, you know, really came about because of Peter.
Yeah, totally different to anything else. So I was really excited to then know that he was going to be at a convention I was going to at Blackpool Magic Convention, as I say, maybe 10 years ago. And we got to meet up, and it's Dan that had actually bumped into him previously at a convention and said, "You've got to meet my friend Mark Lemon. He's like a fan of your work, and I think you'll like what he does."
I'd heard this buzz about a guy that were an absolute genius, but I didn't know who he was. I didn't know anything about him, and I kept hearing the name come up again and again in these private circles. Do you know Mark Lemon? Do you know Mark Lemon? Do you know Mark Lemon? And all I'd ever heard about was this guy that could take people's ideas and turn them into absolute gold dust.
And Pete and I actually, were able to meet up through Dan's introduction at Blackpool that year, and we just became really good friends. And
we hit it off instantly. And the reason that Mark and I hit it off instantly is because one of the very first things that he said to me, he looked at me and he said, "I sent you an email and you didn't respond to it." And as soon as he said that, I knew that we were going to be friends for life.
Pete came down to London. We were working on a project together in London, and I said, "Oh, why don't you stay at my place?" So he came over. He was staying in the spare room, which is where I've got my bookshelf.
And I don't know what it was. There was just this one book on the bookshelf that stood out. Maybe it's because Mark and I had talked about it before. I don't know, but I pulled it off the shelf and I sat reading it and I was hooked. And it was a book called The Dice Man.
And we'd had a chat about it. I know we'd mentioned it previously and talked about it, and then he'd picked up the book and he was like, "Oh, this is the book we were chatting about." And he's like, yeah. And he said, "Oh, can I borrow it?"
And so Mark said, "Yeah, sure, mate, take it."
And actually, I still haven't had the thing back when I think about it.
But I'd taken the book and I was hooked instantly, and Mark let me borrow it. I took it home. And then after I'd read it, I put it to the side and I forgot about it. I forgot about it for years and years and years. And then roll on to 2019.
We both found ourselves working and consulting for Illusionist, where we are now.
We did the How to Read Minds kit, which were a huge success. Went on to do the Principles volumes and then the Cross Keys deck. And somewhere in between that time, Mark Lemon came on board, and that were it for me. I were at home.
Maybe a year ago, we were chatting about the Dice Man theme again.
So I ring Mark, I'm like, "Mark, I've just found the Dice Man book, and I wanna do it. I wanna live like the Dice Man."
And before I know it, here we are today after one hell of a journey.
So I said to Mark, "Are you interested to come along for the ride?" And Mark's like, "I'm not gonna do it."
I've had the easier journey because I've got to make my choices. I've chosen what I've eaten, how I'm getting somewhere, where I'm going, what I'm doing. But I've been along for the ride on all of Pete's choices as well. And it's been, it's had its ups, it's had its downs, but overall it's been a fascinating experience.